What I am going to talk about is the way that we can use artificial intelligence to actually power a team-centric workplace in relation to sort of making sure that our face-to-face relations are as effective and efficient as possible. I should say just before I start that in 1990 to 91, I took a master's degree in IT, so I probably am a seasoned millennial. Which means, and at that time, I saw the first ever email that I'd ever seen being sent, which completely blew me away. Sort of someone actually replied from another university. This was just something completely sort of out of my expectations. There were people there working on voice recognition, people working on sort of neural networks, and so this has a deep history. Everything we talk about in terms of the digital workplace, it might seem like suddenly applications appear. But it's taken me 28 years to get a job in technology, and during this time there's been a phenomenal amount of development of these ideas. They're not things that are just appearing overnight. But first and foremost, why do we go to an office? Why do we sort of sardine ourselves as we did this morning to get here in a train, to commute generally into the sort of centre of a city? Why do we come to the office? I think there are 5 reasons we do that. I'd be interested if you think there are any more than those. Either the sort of practicality of the fact that you haven't actually got anywhere else to work, you can't work at home, you might live in your parents' home, they might not want you to be working there, or there's no cafe in the high street that's suitable for working, so you have to come to the office. The second of these might be that you're instructed to come to the office. There was the famous memo at Yahoo several years ago, which basically said, look, everyone that's out there working at home or working in other spaces, we need you back in the office. We need you working face-to-face, collaborating with one another. There might be a particular technology, and that's usually related to something to do with hardware rather than software. But even that's changing now. Most sort of development can be done in the cloud. It's not as necessary to be physically in a space. It might just be for the social or the buzz. You might actually just enjoy being in the office. There might be amenities, there might be gyms and subsidised staff shops and those sorts of things, which actually make working in the office a pleasant place to be. But the last of those that I don't think you can replicate anywhere, that I think is absolutely vital in terms of being in the office, is to work with your colleagues. It's actually to be together. And I think we'll probably hear a lot about collaboration this morning. I think we've already heard a couple of mentions of it, and we'll probably hear quite a lot about trust. So this is an Economist Intelligence Unit model that I've sort of slightly tweaked, but I'd want you all just to think in terms of collaboration about this being something special. We often use the word collaboration when we just see a bunch of people sitting talking together. Now, they might be talking about the television from last night or a football match or something, but that's not collaboration, that's just conversation. But in work terms, coordination and cooperation both involve some kind of instruction, some kind of necessity to be working together. We're either sort of supporting one another on a project we've been invited into, or a team we regularly work with. But there is a compulsion for us to be working together, a necessity for us to be working together. And I would argue that true collaboration is where that compulsion disappears. We're in a sphere where we actually decide between ourselves that we want to do something. No one's telling us that we need to work together. We've established a common interest. We've established a reason that we want to be working together. And that trust takes time to build. We can be forgiven for thinking sometimes that suddenly bumping into someone in the coffee queue, we just spill the beans. We just completely divulge everything we're working on. We think it'd be fantastic to go and develop this idea together, and we'll make our company a fortune. But it doesn't work like that. Trust takes a long time to build. And it's not just trust, it's this whole atmosphere of psychological safety, if you've ever heard that expression. That's not a safe place, because in a safe place, we don't talk. This is a place for safe conflict where we can actually express ourselves. We can be critical without fear of any sort of repercussions of doing that. But true collaboration is driven by this mutual interest. It's supported by trust, and it happens over a period of time. It's not something that happens instantaneously. So we need to remember that when we think about our relationships in the workplace. Now, what's happened in the last 100 years, and I don't expect you to read all this, but I think we're circulating the slides, so have a look at this later. But I got a bit fed up with a lot of the articles that you've probably read a lot of, where everyone was beating up on open plan working. They come and go in waves and cycles, but there's been a spate of them recently, particularly through a couple of websites. But my response was, what would you rather have instead? If you don't want an open style of working, then tell me what you'd prefer, because I'm quite interested in all of this. And I never got an answer. So I prepared a taxonomy of all of the different work styles we've had really in the last 100 years, because the first modern offices really appeared in the sort of 1920s. So in this sort of 100 years of solitude, we've developed 4 genres, and within that, 14 work styles. What's interesting in all of this is none of these work styles have ever surfaced as being the ultimate panacea, which means we can dispense with the other 13. And all we've ever done is add to this list, because the right work style is the work style that's right for you and for your organisation. There is no panacea. There's no silver bullet or model that means we can just keep delivering this and move on. So our response to all of this has been sort of somewhat nuanced, somewhat confused, and we're still grappling with the issues in each of these work styles in terms of what works within them and what doesn't work within them. But because each one of the 3 main genres has some fundamental issues. If it's an enclosed workspace, it's really cumbersome to reflect the changes that occur in an organisation. So generally speaking, the work doesn't happen. And the actual patterns of relationships and collaborations within the organisation is not then reflected in the physical space. In the open spaces, we create, and even in our discussion this morning on this table, we get a sort of sense of what it's like in a lot of modern workplaces that are open, where there's this sort of race from the tube station or race from the car park in open spaces to get a seat. A lot of beach toweling occurs, where you put your sort of jacket on the chair and to make sure that nobody can use that space for the day. So we create a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress in these spaces. And then in the agile spaces, and I use the term agile to, the difficulty with the term agile is there's probably 3 different uses of it. I'm using it not in terms of software engineering, not in terms of the sort of HR type policies, but a sort of a flexible workplace with a range of different settings that you're expected to move between. But as I'll talk about in a minute, these become very individual-centric. They're really based around individual behaviours and individual choices. And so what we end up with potentially is a very dispersed workforce where it's actually very difficult to find our colleagues and difficult then, back to that pyramid, to identify the opportunities for genuine collaboration. So I'm going to focus primarily on these types within this genre of Agile for the rest of this presentation, and talking about how a team-centric space supported by technology can potentially alleviate some of the problems we encounter. Because this is effectively what happens in an Agile workplace. Fundamentally, we express our individual choice of where we'd like to work. We have our locker, we have our light technology laptop, we have our device-agnostic docking station, and we can kind of go wherever we want and use all of the different amenities and spaces within an office. And then there's a huge value placed on new connections, and so a lot of the intersections we design and a lot of the spaces we design are intended for you to bump into people. You hear the expression sort of serendipity, serendipitous encounters. There's a lot of sort of myth blown up around these because there's very little evidence that serendipitous encounters have ever actually led to anything productive or significant. I'd ask you to think really in terms of your own working lives. Have you ever accidentally bumped into someone with whom you then struck up a fantastic working relationship and produced or developed a new idea or something sensational? And then finally, we look at how our teams get together. So in a lot of the more developed Agile workplaces now, we're seeing the re-emergence of booking systems. I don't think anybody's ever measured the amount of instant messages or Slack messages or emails or text messages that arise as a result of a team trying to find a space to work together. So we've introduced booking systems. I thought we'd seen the back of these things 20 years ago, but they're back. They're back because we're struggling in the Agile workplace to actually do the work that we need to do with our team, which is the fundamental reason for being in the office. If we just wanted a desk, we should stay at home. And the worst example of all of these is the big screens. I don't know if any of you work in a workplace where the lift doors open, you're confronted with a map of the office with red, amber, green dots on the desks. And you head for a green dot and hope that someone else isn't heading for the same green dot because they got there 30 seconds before you did. That's zombification of the workplace, in my view. That's just parking lot. That's just, I need a desk. If you need a desk, as I'm sure we'll talk about this morning, there are plenty of digital tools to support you working at home or in another place. And so, there are 3 challenges in this Agile workplace. The team demand varies. The teams will grow and contract. The nature of their work will change. Teams are constantly changing. The organisation itself is constantly changing in the way teams are comprised. You may actually be members of more than one team. A team's just a flag at the end of the day. It's a reason for those individuals to be associated together. I always maintain that an organisation and the workplace itself is in a state of perpetual beta. You are living in an experiment. It is never finished. While you may have been subject to an organisation that's sort of fitted out its space and spent a lot of money creating something brand new, it continues from there. It has a life. And so in terms of sort of how we organise teams in space, we have to recognise the fact that they are constantly changing. And teams have relationships not just internally, but with other teams, because teams work with other teams. Inter-team relationships are just as important as making sure that you are together in the team that you work with. What if we could actually solve all of these problems? If we could meet that team peak demand at all times to reflect the changes? If we could actually map the collaborations within the organisation so that we could make sure that teams are always working together with the right teams at the right time? And we could actually understand teams growing, contracting, changing the nature of the work we do, and we could continually map all of this. Because at the moment, today's technology is a group of people sitting in the back room with highlighter pens, printouts of plans, post-it notes, calculators. That's the way we've been doing this for 30 years or more. And that's the way most of your organisations will still be doing this. However advanced and sort of shiny and glossy your workplace looks on the outside, there is a back room, and that back room is still powered by human beings. It's the equivalent of the treadmills with the gerbils. That's the way this is working. So we flip this. What we start to create is we say that actually the fundamental place in which you work, because it's the fundamental reason for you being in the office, is the home with your team. It's a guaranteed space. You know where it is, you know where your colleagues are going to be. You don't have to send 300 instant messages to arrange to meet at a certain time at a certain place. You don't have to go onto a booking application to make that happen. If we then need to go and do some of our own private work, or we need to move away from that team space in small groups, we can do that. We can exercise that choice. If we need to work at home using the digital workplace, the digital tools, we can do that, exercise that choice. And then beyond that, in the amenity spaces, we can look at creating those new connections. So we're not actually removing any of the 3 layers that I gave you in the first model. We're just reordering the priorities. We're looking at the workplace in a slightly different way, putting fundamentally at the heart the team space, because it's working with your colleagues that has actually persuaded you to get on the train in the morning and sardine yourself into the city centre. So this is how it moves, just as a sort of by way of comparison. And our sort of primary settings, the work settings that we spend the majority of the time, there is sort of something of a movement that says the desk is dead, but actually the desk has survived for over 2,000 years because it works and it will continue to do so. So don't believe anybody that tells you the desk is dead. It's like there's a creature called the water bear, which is probably the most resilient creature on the planet, would survive everything but the apocalypse, and the desk is sort of quite similar to that in workplace terms. And then in our secondary spaces, which are the sort of breakout spaces, the cooler looking spaces, that's where we actually then move away from the team space, and that's where we have these create these new connections. So the GoSpace application is an example, and I won't dwell on this too much, but it's an example of how we can use a specific AI technology to actually to replace what goes on in the back room. Because this is what's happening with artificial intelligence. It's a specific AI application. You know, we're decades away from general AI. But specific AI applications are able to solve specific, difficult problems. Because this is a problem of dynamic resource allocation, if you've ever heard the expression. A dynamic resource allocation is about just getting the right things in the right place at the right time, because time is the factor that really starts to screw this up in terms of trying to make these allocations. So dynamic workspace allocation needs some data in around the team structures, around the collaborations, around the way that space is being used. And the data out is making sure that we can map those team structures as they change over time, and we can meet peak team usage. So in an agile workplace, we rely a lot on ebb and flow of people. It's sort of average usage. Some teams will be in on the days that other teams are not in, and so you'll find yourself sitting in different places, which is why you find it quite difficult to find your colleagues, because of the way that it's almost expected to be self-organizing. But let's face it, self-organizing is actually time-consuming and very, very difficult. So if we can make sure that we can actually have the right people working together in the right amount of space, adjacent to the people they need to be working with, then it makes your journey into the office and the difficulties of commuting completely worthwhile, because you're actually satisfying the prime need for coming into the office, which is to work with your colleagues. If we can't do that, then we are starting to get ourselves into real difficulty. And we want to be able to do all this quickly, and we want to be able to run multiple scenarios in very little time, because we don't want to spend a week taking on board all of the changes that have occurred in the organisation and then trying to remap that. We want this to be instantaneous. And this is what specific AI is able to do. It's able to think unlike humans in a non-linear fashion. It's able to take multiple problems, multiple challenges simultaneously without just, this isn't brute force technology. This isn't just running thousands of scenarios. This is actually thinking about the problem and producing an outcome as a result of that. And what happens is we're able to satisfy what I describe in the book is the 6 E's of a fantastic workplace, in terms of a workplace being efficient, effective, easy to navigate, environmentally responsible, expressive in terms of supporting the brand, and providing an energy. And you'll hear a lot about well-being in the workplace. An energized workplace is a much bigger and sort of broader idea than simply well-being. Well-being is part of that as a subset. But at the end of the day, we remove a huge amount of the anxiety and stress that we experience in a workplace by making it easy for us to work with our colleagues, where we don't have to make all of those arrangements, where we know we can actually explore the trusting, psychologically safe relationships that we've created. Because effectively, this is what's happening. And I'll leave you with this idea around the augmented decade. I guess the good news in all of this is the human being is very much still part of the process and still will be part of the process. But what we've seen in workplace terms over the decades is that we've become pretty good at gathering data. We've invested a lot of time in data. We've become pretty good at analyzing data, but it's still very much the human being that creates the solutions. And this is really where you will see in a number of areas of your own digital workplace the difference happening in the next decade is that we're actually going to be into the decade of solutions. That's what specific AI can do. So what you'll see is the proportion of solution time between the human being and the technology pretty much remaining the same. We are augmenting the human decision-making process, but we're able to do that with much less investment in our own time. We're able to do it faster, better, cheaper. But we are very much still driving this. So when you're looking at digital solutions and everybody tells you that you'll get fantastic analytics and it's a smart system, it's not smart unless it can produce solutions, which is why I get rather frustrated when people talk about smart buildings, because smart buildings are just high-performing buildings. They don't think about anything. They don't come up with solutions. Specific AI is about solutions. Our next decade will be the augmented decade. It's the decade of solutions. It's really exciting. I mean, it's going to automate a few tasks within our roles. It's not going to replace jobs, but it's just going to make us better at doing what we do. It's going to reduce that solution time. It's going to make sure we can produce more solutions than we've ever produced before. So I think it's a reason to be fully optimistic. Hopefully that's given you an insight into how a team-centric workplace can make a much better use of your time when you're in the office space. And I'm very happy to answer any questions. Thank you.